Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon to all. And thank you to our witnesses here today. As you are well aware, today's hearing on issues and concerns facing the Navy and Marine Corps strike fighter community comes at a time when the entire naval aviation enterprise is under tremendous strain from several directions. The first challenge is funding, as the chairman stated so well. I agree that sequester-level funding has constrained our ability to make the thoughtful investments in these types of important capabilities. A second challenge centers on continuing problems with the life support systems for F-18 Hornet and Super Hornet aircraft, the aircraft that make up almost all of the Navy and Marine Corps fighter fleets. Specifically, problems with decompression incidents in older F-18s and possible oxygen system contamination in newer F-18s continue to plague the fleet. As Chairman Turner mentioned, this subcommittee had a hearing just over a year ago where these same issues were discussed in some detail. And I thank Lieutenant General Davis and Rear Admiral Moran for appearing before us again today to provide an update. Since that time, the Navy has continued to aggressively pursue equipment fixes, improve diagnostic equipment, provide additional aircrew training, and focus significant leadership attention to this issue. Importantly, I think the Navy has developed a clearer understanding of which aircraft are beset by each of these physiological events. However, while some progress has been made, the overall rate of incidents for 2016 were worse than they were in 2015. For the first few months of 2017, some parts of the fleet have seen improvement, while other parts have plateaued or gotten worse. So the situation is mixed. While it has not garnered as much recent attention as the overall state of F-18 readiness in the fleet, I believe we must address this issue because it directly affects the lives of the brave men and women operating these aircraft. With this in mind, before we proceed, I'd like to read a portion of a letter sent to our committee by a family member of an F-18 pilot. While it only provides one person's perspective on the problem, I think it tells the story in a way all of us can appreciate. Quote, and I will continue to read until we come to the end of it and then unquote. My brother is a pilot and department head in an F-18 squadron. In the last year, they have had at least 20 incidents of the aircraft's environmental control system malfunctioning, leading to pilots developing decompression sickness and resulting in several incidents of hospitalizations and trips to a decompression chamber or dive chamber. My brother alone has had 3 decompression incidents in the last 3 months. After his most recent incident, his decompression sickness was left undiagnosed for 4 days. Before finally receiving treatment, he was so mentally impaired that he could not perform basic arithmetic and spent 6 hours in a decompression chamber. In another instance, a squadron pilot has persistently failed neurological exams despite 3 rounds of treatment in the decompression chamber and multiple MRIs. Hornet pilots I've spoken with confidentially predict that a fatality will result soon if the situation is not addressed. Naval aviators volunteer for a high-risk profession. However, the dangers inherent in flying military missions are vastly different than the risk of harm that accrues from piloting an aircraft with systems that are operating well beyond their life expectancy and frequently failing in unpredictable ways. The key here is that these airplanes are failing in ways engineers didn't predict and thus eliminate the aircrew's ability to safely troubleshoot a system failure in flight. Funding and attention needs to be diverted to immediately solve this issue, as was done when problems with the oxygen system developed with the U.S. Air Force's F-22, unquote. I think that letter lays out the problem as well as any facts and figures I could cite. The incidents taking place and the possible causes are admittedly complex, but the lack of overall progress, despite the best efforts of all involved, is of great concern. I look forward today to getting into the details of developments in this area, what is being done, and options for the future. And with that, I yield back and look forward to hearing from today's witnesses. Thank you. I'd like to return to my opening comments and follow up on the issue of the physiological events and talk about the status of the F-18's challenges in the area of aircrew life support right now, these issues that exist right now, specifically the crew cabin pressure issues in older F-18s and possible oxygen system contamination in newer F-18s. The information that you all provided to the committee for this hearing showed an increase in the rate of physiological events in all three elements of the F-18 fleet throughout fiscal year 2016 as compared to 2015. This included a 90% increase in the rate for F-18A through D models, a much smaller 11% increase for F-18E and F models, but a more than doubling of the rate for the EA-18G model aircraft. Admiral Miller, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
The same information provided to the committee covering the first 3 months of fiscal year 2017 showed a further 66% increase for the oldest F-18s, no increase in the rate for newer F-18s, and a 30% decrease for EA-18Gs. Are these figures correct, Admiral Miller?
Yes, ma'am.
And for the oldest F-18s, the data show a more than tripling of the rate of incidents from the first quarter of 2015 through the first quarter of 2017. I know that increase has gotten the attention of the Navy, and a lot is being done, and I certainly appreciate that. But the committee has been informed that the Navy has done some selective grounding of problem aircraft recently, both to reduce risk and to conduct engineering studies. So first, I'd just like to get a better sense of the scope of grounded aircraft across the fleet. Admiral Miller, can you give me a sense of how many classic or legacy F-18s are grounded across the fleet for this reason?
Ma'am, I think I'd have to defer to Admiral Moran, who probably has more information on the technical data. What I can tell you is confirm the numbers that you have, because that's what we've been presented. I will tell you from a naval aviation leadership perspective, which includes all three of us at the table here, as Admiral Moran in his opening remarks said, is that air crew safety is always our #1 priority, and with regard to safety, this physiological episode issue is our #1 safety issue. Since we've testified before this committee last year, efforts have expanded considerably, mostly with air crew training and with data collection. As well as maintenance procedures. So with that, if okay with you, I'll defer to Admiral Moran, who I think can give you a lot more information on the technical issues of how we're proceeding.
Admiral Moran.
Yes, ma'am. I appreciate the question. You know, we have a protocol, the Navy does. Whenever there's a PE event on any aircraft.
Sir, could you move your microphone up?
Yes, sir. Could you hear me?
It's a directional object. If you'd make it straight. Thank you.
Can you hear me now, sir? Yes. There we go. Sorry about that. The protocol we have in the Navy today is any time an aircraft experiences a PE event, it is taken out of service. And so we have protocols we've developed over the last year and a half that go ahead and review every ECS component on that airplane. We check each one out. We send that and the life support systems back for an engineering investigation to verify if we can find what was a causal factor for that PE event in the airplane. So the CO of each squadron, Navy, Marine Corps, always has that ability to take that aircraft and ground it and take it out of service. But we have protocols we developed to bring it back into service. And once we go through that and verify, if we can, the causal factor and replace those ECS components to get it back into a flyable state. We've had a couple instances in airplanes that were bad performers that were repeat no matter what the air crew or the maintainers did on the airplane. We get it flying, we'd experience some kind of PE event. So we would take that, and the fleet really was great for us. We transferred that to Pax River, Maryland, and we took it to our test squadron, and we instrumented that airplane. We still have it. And so we instrumented the whole ECS system to try to figure out where the problems were on some of these components within ECS systems. So we're still going through that process. We've learned a ton on some of the valves and switches in that system that we just previously have not replaced on a, kind of replace them on an as-failed nature. So if the fleet reported them as failed, we replace them. And so we've determined that, hey, we're not going to do that anymore. From what we're seeing, we're going to do what we call force replacement. So let's get back on a scheduled time period to replace these parts and components. And the Naval Supply System DLA have been fantastic. We've been going after the supply base, going to find the parts and components so we can do this force reset. We call it the ECS reset because we just didn't do that on some of these airplanes. And so now kind of getting to that piece. So hopefully that answers your question, ma'am.
Well, is there a tipping point for any particular airplane in which you just decide to ground it permanently because despite your best efforts, you can't bring it back? There are those that you find the problem and you think you fix it, but those airplanes in which you think you fixed it, but you haven't. So what is the tipping point for a particular aircraft, or in general for the fleet, in terms of just broad numbers?
Yes, ma'am. So we do have what we call a strike board that Admiral Miller is responsible for, working with the TICOMs out in the fleet on balancing that. And so all of that information, whether it's a PE or there's a structural challenge with the airplane that's just too costly to go ahead and repair, we go ahead and make that determination to strike it from the inventory and not do anything more with that. The only airplane, we've had two now, that we've really had a hard time fixing in terms of the PE, that no matter what we did, we couldn't do it. The one of them is in Pax River now. The other one we're considering taking down. We're going to do what we call really a teardown of the complete ECS system on that airplane. And so I think the fleet's in the position now is taking that one out of service too, because that'll give us insight, because there's just some components that are really hard to get that are embedded in the airframe structure that we want to get a better look at. So this is all part of that ECS reset for the Legacy Hornets. And I will tell you, lessons learned. We're going after that really hard on the Super Hornet fleet as well. So we have two airplanes in Boeing right now as we speak that are part of the SLAP effort for the Super Hornet, and they're a learning aircraft so we can understand material condition. We just put Boeing on contract. Hey, as we tear that aircraft apart, both of those aircraft, let's look at the ECS system from beginning to end to understand it. So when we go ahead and take that into the sustainment mods in the early 20s, we're going after the ECS system from the get-go on that airplane.
Well, I appreciate these efforts, but I ask these questions so we have a sense of where things go from here. Because as all three of you know so well, the majority of both the Navy and the Air Force's strike fighter fleet is made up of both older and newer F-18s, which you're addressing. And that was not the case with the Air Force when it grounded the F-22 fleet, whereas the Air Force could ground its F-22 fleet without major, albeit serious, consequences for its overall operations. Grounding the F-18 fleet would have far-reaching implications for the majority of naval strike missions. So I highlight this point to underscore the importance of the work being done by the independent review team and the physiological episode team, and if we have time, I'll follow up with questions about that. But also just wanted to draw attention again to the mitigation efforts you all are investing in to keep your pilots safe, whether it's wearing a dive watch so that they know if there's a decompression incident, their fleet awareness training for hypoxia, decompression chambers to help pilots who have experienced the depressurization. I think this tells you how very serious this issue is, and it calls for some real solutions. I just wanted to follow up on the independent review team. Last year's NDAA mandated that the Navy put together one that you would report to us by December 1st. I'd take the answer in writing, but just wanted to know where that stands, the composition, what your timelines are. Do you expect to meet that December 1st deadline? So just because these incidents are ongoing and very serious, and do think this team has an important role to play. So leave it at that, but thank you all for your testimony today.